Holy crap, quick tutorials, this guy's been gone for like a really long time. Yes, I know. I've been doing all this drone stuff and teaching courses on photography and one on filming and editing, but I have good news. I have come to share new developments in my research. First of all, I'm really sorry. I hate long videos on YouTube where people just talk and talk. I just want to give you a side-by-side, but there's too many weird things going on in each of these cameras for me to not address them, and I have to compensate settings for each of them. So I'll explain for each what you're looking at, and hopefully that helps your buying decision. This is still the most common question I get from students who have taken the course. What is the real difference in the picture quality between these drones, and is it worth the money? Let me just tell you ahead of time, there are two huge variables that will change the quality you get from these drones. The first is the color profile and settings you use in the camera. The other is, are you actually planning on grading this footage yourself in the editor? And reading two guys arguing in the comments on a 5-year-old drone forum isn't going to do it. Here I'm going to film and edit with all the settings to give you some visual perspective to see how this footage actually edits in the editor, how it looks out of the camera, and if it's worth the extra money to you. I've got 3 cameras here, the Phantom 3 Standard, the Phantom 4 Pro, and the Mavic Pro. I'm going to be shooting at 24 frames a second with all these drones. The Phantom 3 Standard has a 1/2.3-inch sensor, the same size as the Mavic. The Phantom 4 Pro has a full 1-inch sensor. I'll show you in a little bit what difference that makes. The Phantom 3 Standard does 2.7K and the other two do 4K. I don't think that's a deal breaker though. I honestly think it's debatable. The very first thing we're looking at is default everything. This is straight out of the camera, so no color settings and no color grading in the editor. And while I tell people to never shoot like this because default everything looks awful, some people do film this way, so for their sake, we're going to show what it looks like. I'm going to do just a little bit of color grading to make this look nicer on each of these. People with the Phantom 4 Pro are going to notice this first. It picks up the shadows better and the clouds are more even with the sky. In general, you can see it's just a more satisfying color and image. Then we have the Mavic, which is a step down, and you can start to see a little bit of the issues in the contrast, how it handles the shadows. Then of course in last place is the Phantom 3 Standard, and you can already see all the issues you have with the color in this picture. The biggest issue being that I'm lying, this is the Phantom 4 Pro. I showed you this backwards to make a point. These 3 images, if I didn't give you a heads up and tell you what was what, you would have no idea. I can get really snooty and actually talk about the shadows and the clouds and things like that. Most people, they're not watching it in 4K, they're not looking at all the details, and they won't care. You're talking about somebody sitting on an iPhone. You're basically looking at exactly the same picture 3 times. So if this is all you want to get out of your drone, no editing, no toying around with it, you only need to spend the money for the Phantom 3 Standard. And for $400 used, you're getting a great picture in 2.7K, and it flies. It's still just incredible you can get this in 2018. Here's where it gets annoying and things are going to start getting inconsistent. Each of these cameras need different settings to get optimal footage. The Mavic has a weird artificial blurring to look cinematic, I guess, so I add 1 to the sharpness to negate that. And you'll notice it if you look at the solar panels. The Phantoms have an artificial sharpening that looks tacky, and it causes problems like aliasing, so I take down the sharpness to get rid of that. However, for all of these, and this is the first thing everybody should do, lower the sharpness 2 for the Phantoms and raise it 1 if you have a Mavic. That would be this first column here. The contrast needs to go, it looks awful, it ruins all your footage. Drop it 3 for the Phantoms and 1 for the Mavic. Of course, saturation, I want to do that in post, so I take it down 2 on every drone. You should see an instant, massive improvement in your ability to see shadows and bright spots like the sky or clouds at the same time. After just a little bit of touching up with Lumetri and Premiere, it looks way better. And in a side-by-side, this is 100 times better than where we just started. So why am I avoiding all the default settings that are built in? The rule of thumb is to shoot in the flattest picture profile you have, and here it's D-Log. That way you capture the most without anything being too bright or too dark, and you can decide on the color in your editor, which is much more powerful than your tiny processor in the drone. And while the Phantom 3 and the Mavic are fine, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the most expensive drone here, the Phantom 4 Pro, the one you really should be using for D-Log, this D-Log is so super muddy. They make your ISO rigid at 500, and I hate using ISO. I'm sure there's a technical purpose behind this of why that's important to stay there. The point is you can't control it. I think it looks bad. The exposure meter said it was lit fine, and I even bumped it up in a couple shots, but it still came out lifeless and dark every time. Sometimes it's passable, but half the time I've gotten home and edited it, and it comes out foggy and murky. The closer to default I have with the Phantom 4 Pro actually looks way better. So because I want this all to be a level playing field, I'm shooting all of these in D-Cine-alike, which is still a good profile, is still very usable, and we can decide how we feel with that. The raw footage isn't going to be too overwhelming, but once we start color grading this, you can see the differences start to show. The Phantom 3 Standard falls to the back because immediately you can see that in the background there's not as much sharpness, and that's obviously because it's 2.7K. Aside from the smaller sensor, it has a smaller data rate, so it's not saving as much information into the file, and you can't color grade very much without it looking weird. The halfway point between that and the Phantom 4 Pro is the Mavic, which uses the same small sensor, again, barely bigger than the iPhone sensor, but it's 4K and it has a better processor in it, so it handles the footage better, and for what it does a really good job. And then the winner here is the Phantom 4 Pro, and I say that in a really not excited way because for the extra money, you were talking about a very small discrepancy in quality. I mean, like on a scale of 1 to 100, we're talking about like 4 or 5% in broad daylight in this environment. I'm gonna notice this because I've seen a million of these things. The Phantom 4 Pro's 1-inch sensor, it looks like it has some, I guess, depth to the environment. It feels a bit more cinematic, and something that happens with those smaller sensors, again, it can start to do this thing where the image feels kind of like condensed. I don't know how else to explain that. It just feels closer to 2D than the 1-inch sensor, which just feels like it's in the actual environment a little bit more. Once again, that's barely a little bit. The other thing, 100 megabytes per second in the data rate from the Phantom 4 Pro versus only 60 in the Mavic Pro. I thought out of the gate I would be able to see a big difference in all that data, in the shadows and the highlights, but I don't. And I realized the problem was that I exposed all of this correctly, so it shot well to begin with. But what happens if I shoot this footage way too bright? To start off with, the sky is basically not visible. You can try your best in Lumetri to fix this by taking down the contrast of the highlights, but you still wind up with a super unusable blown out sky. In the Phantom, I can already see clouds to begin with, even though it's overexposed. Now that I'm in lighting extremes, I'm feeling the extra data rate and higher dynamic range. And after some coloring and lighting adjustments in Lumetri, I have a sky that you can tell has clouds with the foreground that's still visible. With the Mavic, you have to know how to light it on the spot. If you mess up a little bit, you're kind of stuck that way. The reason the Phantom 4 Pro stands out against the other ones is because with 100 megabytes per second, if I film this too bright, I can correct. If I film it too dark, I can add light and it doesn't ruin the image. I mean, I can film this with all that bad contrast and default color profile and still edit it down to look like usable footage. I couldn't do that with the Mavic. So the Phantom 4 Pro actually has enormous utility with being able to correct the footage. You do have technically better dynamic range, it does pick up a little bit more shadows, but that to me alone isn't a big enough sell. Being able to adjust the footage like this is important to me. I'm also trying to film this really quickly because there's this enormous Haboob death storm rolling in right when I'm filming. This is where things really become unfair, but the second that you're in a low light environment, the Phantom 4 Pro trumps pretty much every other drone I've used. Having a full 1-inch sensor at sunset really just can't be beat by the smaller sensors. And on the subject of low light, because the sensors are so small in these other drones, when you use any ISO and it just puts more power into the sensor to try and pick up more light, it falls apart completely. All the drones, except for the Phantom 4 Advanced and Pro, have pretty much unusable ISO, but with the Phantom 4, I could go up to 800 ISO before I noticed any serious issues. If your number one intention is to film in low light, the Phantom 4 Pro is phenomenal. The beautiful marriage between these two just came out, and it's the DJI Mavic 2 Pro. The Mavic 2 Zoom is just the normal Mavic, but with a zooming feature, but the Pro has a 1-inch sensor like the Phantom 4 Pro, and it's quieter, shoots in 100 megabytes per second, and it flies just like the Mavic. It's absolutely beautiful. The footage is phenomenal. The dynamic range is very, very impressive. I'm so happy with this drone. I will always justify the kind of power this thing gives you for $1,500 new as of right now, but if you can't afford it, it's not the end of the world, so just make up for it with good shots and editing. And again, almost everything you see I filmed with the Mavic 1, which is a medium data rate and a not very good dynamic range, and it still comes out fine as long as you know how to control the image and the drone well. There's also this thing about the Phantom 4 Pro being able to shoot in 60 frames a second, but that's a fun feature. It's not a make or break. I love being able to shoot 60 frames a second. The files are bigger and it's more work to edit, yes, but you can slow that down to 40% speed and it'll look the way 24 frames per second does, really nice and smooth, cinematic. But again, that's a fun feature. It's not a necessity. Pretty much all the actual work I do with any of these drones is going to be done in 24 frames a second anyway, so this isn't necessarily the end of the world unless you're shooting tons of action like a dirt bike race or surfers. There is one last thing I'll bring up, and that is the make or break for me. This is the bottom line. The Mavic flies a million times better than the Phantom. The Phantom feels like a floating tank. Even with playing with the gimbal settings and controls all day long, I cannot get it to move smoothly. Even if I fly in a straight line, sometimes I get this weird wobble. It feels like flying a boat. But the Mavic feels like a hawk. It just moves really well. I can do 4 functions at once. I can rise, move in any direction, smoothly pan the camera, and turn the angle of the drone at the same time, and it's all seamless. It all moves together well. It's not like this by default at all. This is because I've set the settings that way, but the point is it has a potential to move this way. And the Phantom, I just can't get it to not do an awkward jerk every once in a while. And that to me personally is really important. As for photos, I'm a photographer. All these drones are going to give you the same thing basically. I'm sure there are 20-minute reviews about the differences in photo quality on each of these, but seriously, that's being stupidly picky. They all shoot RAW format and it's basically the same after Lightroom. So here's a review. The Phantom 3 shoots excellent 2.7K if your ego can get over not having 4K. If you can adjust a few settings from default, your footage will look great. You don't have much room to color grade, so do it right the first time, and if you just want to take footage from the camera and put it wherever online, this is perfect. It's also cheap. The Mavic is just as good as the Phantom 4 Pro in midday if you set it up correctly. Tons of fun, portable, discreet, makes you want to go film more. 4K footage, but light it right the first time because you don't have much wiggle room to fix it in editing. This drone is the best flyer. It lets you get not good, but flawless pans, tilts, tracking, even on a windy beach. No errors, super smooth. The best controller, it's tiny in your hands and it just feels great moving things left and right. The Phantom 4 Pro has the best picture quality by a hair, a weak, thin, expensive hair. Much more flexible footage in the editor, so if you screw up, it's probably salvageable. It's great in low light, the best by far. High dynamic range means extremes like sunset will be more visible while shadows on the ground are too, if you screwed up. It shoots 60 frames a second, but it doesn't fly as well as the Mavic, and it's the most expensive. It's also much louder and has an awkward giant remote, but that remote will charge your phone while it's plugged in, which is pretty dope. I do still go grab the Mavic more than the others, so I will definitely strongly recommend it over the other two for being less expensive but still basically the best quality. Download some sample footage I have below. We also have an email list you can hop on if you like getting free stuff like comparison footage, photos, product discounts, things like that. You'll also get a heads up when the course is open for enrollment again. My name is Alex Harris from Drone Launch Academy.